Did John Rawls believe in complete equality?
No, Rawls, 1921 to 2002, was not an advocate of total distributive justice or the ideal that all members of society should receive equal amounts of everything. But he applied the standard of fairness to inequalities through his difference principle. Inequalities must be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society.
What were Maimonides' main intellectual contributions?
After Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, and his family fled forced conversions in Spain, they settled in Cairo, Egypt, in 1165, where Maimonides was the physician of the vizier of Saladin, c. 1138 to 1193, he wrote 10 books on medicine, but it was his works on Jewish theology that represented his most important contribution to Judaism. Book of the Commandments treated the 613 laws from the Old Testament. Commentary on the Mishnah explained the practical purposes of the old rabbinical code. And Mishnah Torah, codified Talmudic law in 14 volumes and retains its classic status to the present. However, it was Maimonides' philosophical treatise, Guide of the Perplexed, that had direct influence over a broad range of Western philosophy.
What have been the main themes in philosophical feminism?
Philosophical feminists have thus far been very open to theoretical work from other disciplines. They have concentrated on theorizing the oppression of women in the history of philosophy, as well as contemporary culture. The result in the United States alone has been a vast body of work with many facets. Although feminism is hardly part of mainstream philosophy in academia, most philosophy departments now have women members. Examples of influential feminist scholarship include feminist reclamation, feminist epistemology, feminist political theory, and gender theory. An excellent overview of these subjects is Alison M. Jagger and Marian Young's A Companion to Feminist Philosophy, 2000.
Who was Rudolf Carnap?
Rudolf Carnap, 1891 to 1970, is famous for his work on scientific verification. He received his PhD from the University of Jena. He was a member of the Vienna Circle until he left Germany in 1935 to teach at the University of Chicago and the University of California at Los Angeles. In his early work he focused on the logical structure of language and what it implied about the world. In the 1940s, Carnap worked on logic and introduced the idea of a state description, which is the linguistic form of a possible world, or the most complete description of the world that can be given in any language. Unlike earlier logical positivists, Carnap addressed the problem of inconclusive evidence. For actual scientific verification and the meaning of scientific terms, he argued for the use of probability in determining degrees of confirmation in place of absolute verification. Carnap's principal works include The Logical Structure of the World, 1928, English translation, 1967. Philosophy and Logical Syntax, 1935, Introduction to Semantics, 1942, Formalization of Logic, 1943. Meaning and Necessity, A Study in Semantics and Modal Logic, 1947, and Logical Foundations of Probability, 1950.
Why did Pierre Gassendi promote mitigated skepticism?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, and his colleagues placed a high value on the new science of the time, which included the heliocentric, sun-centered solar system theory after the Copernican revolution, the atomic theory holding that the activities of all matter were determined by its smallest particles or atoms, and a rejection of those parts of the Aristotelian views of science that were in disagreement with these views. Gassendi's use of skepticism to attack Aristotle, and his use of moderate skepticism to support the new science, therefore made perfect sense. It helped Gassendi's cause that he was well liked and highly regarded among his colleagues in the Catholic Church, as well as by some of the more extreme skeptics of his day, and that he was careful not to go against church doctrine. Indeed, while defending the new science on the one hand, and insisting that no scientific knowledge could be certain on the other, Gassendi was able to live and think in both the traditional Catholic world and the new scientific one.
Who were the Cambridge Neoplatonists?
The founder of the group was understood to be Benjamin Whichcote, 1609–1683. Whichcote called reason the candle of the Lord. Henry More, 1614–1687, Ralph Cudworth, 1617–1688, and John Smith, 1616–1652, were three further distinguished Cambridge Platonists. Cudworth was the father of John Locke's lifelong friend and lady of the household in which he spent his last years, Damaris Cudworth. Additional Cambridge Platonists of note were Nathaniel Culverwell, 1619–1651, Peter Sterry, 1613–1672, George Rust, d. 1670, John Worthington, 1618–1671, and Simon Patrick, 1626–1707. Whichcote, More, Cudworth, and Smith were associated with Emmanuel College. Calvinism was the leading doctrine there, and they all rebelled against it. Henry More was the most intellectually active member of the group.
Quine on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
In 1957 Putnam published the article The Analytic and the Synthetic. In the anthology Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science, edited by H. Fagel and G. Maxwell, 1962, in which he showed how the history of the definitions of kinetic energy made it impossible to divide statements about kinetic energy into analytic and empirical, or synthetic ones.
Aquinas really have a recipe for making mice?
Like many of his contemporaries, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed in the spontaneous generation of insects and vermin. The doctrine of spontaneous generation held that life could literally just appear without the prior presence of parent organisms. This biological mythology went back to Aristotle and is in fact strangely empirical, if you think about it. Flies, for example, do suddenly seem to appear out of rotting garbage. It took a long time, well into the 17th century, to discover that the maggots they spring from come from eggs laid by parent flies. Aquinas thought that insects sprang to life in filth, owing to the devil's influence. He thought that the development of mice, however, depended on changes in the positions of the stars. As proof of this origin of baby mice, Aquinas had a recipe. Take some old rags and wheat and leave them undisturbed in a drawer for a while, to give the stars enough time to exert their effects, and then take a peek. Again, there is a crude empiricism at work here. If there are mice in a dwelling, its inhabitants rarely see them breed. And rarer still do they observe female mice building nests and giving birth. If this has happened in a neglected drawer, all that may be evident when one suddenly opens it is the litter of pink babies when the last time one looked there was nothing but old rags and wheat. If you try this at home, the wheat is probably unnecessary. Although the mother mouse will doubtless appreciate it.
What was ironic about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's last lecture?
Merleau-Ponty died suddenly of a stroke while preparing to give a lecture on René Descartes, 1596–1650. He repeatedly returned to Descartes' split between the mind and the body in composing his own philosophy. He did not accept the Cartesian split, but sought to address the mind and body as a united whole. Merleau-Ponty thought that a person's own body, le corps propre, should be in its personal, individual, lived reality, a scientific subject. It is one's own body that makes consciousness corporeal. He wrote, "Insofar as I have hands, feet, a body, I sustain around me intentions which are not dependent on my decisions and which affect my surroundings in a way that I do not choose." Clearly, Merleau-Ponty's stroke proves this point because it was not something he chose. but definitely something that conclusively affected not only his surroundings but the possibility of his even having those surroundings. What's ironic is that he made his point by having a stroke, which is very different from making a philosophical argument.
What is Plato's simile of the cave?
Plato introduces the simile of the cave in the Republic to convey the power of the experience of forms and describe their importance. It is his metaphysics in a poetic nutshell. Imagine a cave where prisoners are chained to the wall and the only objects they can see are shadows of things carried behind a fire in back of them. If a prisoner is freed, he will first encounter the objects in the cave whose shadows he has seen before. If he ascends out of the cave, imagine his amazement when he sees these objects and the rest of the world, in full sunlight. Imagine also how his fellow prisoners might react if he attempts to relate what he has seen to them. The cave represents normal existence and perception, and the objects in sunlight are the world of the forms.
What is the big problem with Hume's reduction of the self to perceptions?
Overall, Hume saw the mind as a kind of theater stage, across which ideas pass, with each idea a separate existence of sense or logical relation. He did not address the implied question of whom the audience is that has access to this theater. What he was looking for and failed to find was an object of reflection that could in a unitary, distinct way, justify the term self. He was not looking for the reflector, or the I in search of itself. He simply assumed that this reflector was not the self he was looking for when one enters most intimately into what I call myself. Another way of putting this is that Hume's analysis of the self cannot account for that process of analysis, of reflecting on one's own ideas. Hume did not take into account the fact that he was reflecting, and that the thing he was that was reflecting is what is meant by the word self.
How have Japanese, Chinese, and Indian philosophy recently entered Anglo-American philosophy?
Asian philosophy came to the West as Buddhism from Japanese, Chinese and Indian philosophy, and Neo-Confucianism from Chinese philosophy. Given the common thread of Buddhism throughout Asia, many might be tempted to designate all philosophy from Japan, China, and India as Asian philosophy or Eastern philosophy. But there are other systems of thought and religion just as diverse as Buddhist traditions. Also, the different Buddhist traditions derive from cultures that have very distinctive histories, as well as very different current political and economic situations and ties to the West. That their theological dimensions are not Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, is probably all that the philosophies of these areas broadly understood to be more than Buddhism and Confucianism have in common. Although Euro-American intellectuals in other fields have well developed scholarly traditions based on Eastern texts, it should be noted that philosophers, as a profession, are relative latecomers to Eastern philosophy. For instance, the British biochemist Joseph Needham, 1900 to 1995, wrote extensively on technology and science in the history of China. The 19th-century German novelist Hermann Hesse introduced an international readership to Indian thought and Buddhism in his 1922 novel Siddhartha, and philosophy's own Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, was fascinated by Chinese thought. The question is, what do philosophers put on their curricula from Eastern thought in new ways that emphasize a commonality of philosophical interests? Again, the answer is Buddhism, on account of its resonance with Western metaphysics and epistemology, and Confucianism for what it teaches about virtue ethics.
Did the Eastern philosophers interact much with the St. Louis Hegelians?
Although they were not academic philosophers, the St. Louis philosophers were in conversation with the Eastern transcendental thinkers, such as those of the Concord School of Philosophy, which had been organized by William Harris, 1835–1909, and transcendentalist Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799–1888. The Concord School held conferences during the summer from 1879 to 1887, and when Alcott first visited Harris in St. Louis, he was abused by Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826–1906, in what the Hegelian observers called the first bout between East and West. The result was celebrated as a victory for the West. Another famed Eastern philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882, also visited the St. Louis Philosophical Society.
What was Vico's cyclical idea of history?
Vico believed that there are cultural patterns that dominate in different societies. Thus, law, religion, politics, art, and manners all tend to match up at any given time and place. For example, he drew connections between Athenian law and its pre-Socratic and Socratic philosophies. In his cyclical account of history, or what he called corsi e ricorsi, societies organically develop and then age and rot. He posited a bestial condition, a time of the gods, and a time of heroes, which also leads to oligarchies, or rule by the richest. This is followed by an age of men, characterized by class conflict, until the society decays. Vico applied this theory to the history of Rome, beginning with the mythical founders Romulus and Remus and ending with its overthrow by external barbarians.
What is analytic ethics?
Analytic ethics is the application of both or either logical positivism and ordinary language analysis to ethics.
What is feminism and feminist philosophy?
Feminism involves both thought and practice aimed at improving the well-being of women. On the side of practice, it is often thought of as the women's movement. Intellectually, feminism is a critical theory because it contains analysis of social conditions and prescriptions for improving them toward its end. Also, on the intellectual side, feminism is now a multidisciplinary academic field with participation from all of the humanities, contemporary cultural criticism, the social sciences, and women's studies. Feminist philosophy is the philosophical dimension of intellectual feminism. Many feminist philosophers understand their intellectual history and the history of the women's movement in terms of three waves.
What were George Simmel's thoughts on fashion and money?
Simmel distinguished between individuals' personal selves and social selves, the latter being necessary for functioning in complex societies. Both fashion and money had symbolic uses in this sense. Simmel believed that fashion was limited to life in cities, because, as he wrote, it intensifies a multiplicity of social relations, increases the rate of social mobility and permits individuals from lower strata to become conscious of the styles and fashions of upper classes. His view of money was similar in that he felt it can operate as an impersonal form of exchange, as well as having value. Through money, subordination and domination can be expressed, while at the same time money permits more freedom within society. Simmel was also aware of the disadvantages of the use of money in its ability to create special hardships and crises in social identity.
Who was Amos Bronson Alcott?
Amos Bronson Alcott, 1799 to 1888, was the father of writer Louisa May Alcott. He founded a school and a utopian community called Fruitlands. As a transcendentalist, he combined Platonism, German mysticism, and American Romanticism. He largely followed the teachings of the leading Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing, who preached a gentle form of religious belief and practice, against Calvinism. Alcott's publications include New Connecticut, Tablets 1868, Concord Days, 1872, and Sonnets and Canzonets, 1882. Most of his other work is still unpublished, except for his vague Orphic sayings that appeared in the Dial and which is representative of transcendental thought.
When did women philosophers first start to become recognized as part of philosophy?
Beginning in the early Christian era, the scholarly work and educational activities of at least some women philosophers were recognized. And some male philosophers made special efforts to interact with them intellectually.
What was Peter Lombard's contribution to medieval philosophy?
Peter Lombard, c. 1095 to 1160, was an Italian theologian who wrote the Book of Sentences. He was educated in Bologna, Reims, and Paris, and he taught at Notre Dame, becoming a canon there from 1144 to 1145.
What is known about Copernicus' life?
Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, also spelled Mikolaj Kopernik, was born in Turin, Prussia, in what is now Poland. He was educated in liberal arts, canon law, and medicine at the universities in Krakow, Poland, and Bologna and Padua, Italy. He received a doctorate in canon law from the University of Ferrara when he was 30. His uncle, the Bishop of Ermland, got him the post as canon of the Cathedral of Frauenburg in 1497. And he also served as physician to his uncle. Copernicus' job as canon involved diplomatic work and administration of church estates. He knew Greek and translated Byzantine poetry into Latin. He was knowledgeable about economics and developed interests in astronomy and mathematics. He became known for his astronomical observations and calculations. And in 1514 Pope Leo X asked him to help reform the calendar. Copernicus refused because he did not think enough was known about the motions of the sun and moon. Although he is widely reported to have contributed to calendar reform, nonetheless, Copernicus began developing his theories in 1512 and presented a short description of his system, Commentariales, to a small group of friends. His major work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium Libri 4, 1543, was published in the same year he died. At the time of his death, he also left a treatise on monetary reform, Monetae Kudendi Ratio, for the Prussian provinces of Poland. First printed in 1816, but written in 1526, this work advocated a uniform coinage, preservation of the quality of the coin, and a charge to the nobility for minting the coin. Copernicus anticipated Gresham's law, which states that debased money drives good money out of circulation.
What was Martin Heidegger's theory of space?
Dasein creates space by assigning proximity or distance to objects in the world with which it is concerned. And the space that results from existence in this way does not necessarily line up with abstract dimensions and distances. The eyeglasses on a person's nose, for example, are farther away to the wearer than the picture hanging on the wall that he or she looks through the glasses to see. Objects in space acquire a characteristic of being ready to hand. They are things that we use and manipulate. The ready to hand, although literally in space, has its real meaning through human action over time. For example, if you pick up a hammer, you intend to do something with it in the next few minutes. And you are doing that to achieve a goal after that, such as hanging a picture on the wall.
How did Peter Kropotkin come to form his life philosophy?
Kropotkin's father was a general, and Kropotkin was educated in the Corps of Pages. Becoming an attendant to Tsar Alexander II. He received a commission in the mounted Cossacks of the Amur and went to Siberia, where he investigated the penal system. What he saw turned him against the repressive form of government in place. In his 20s, Kropotkin led expeditions into unchanged arid areas of Siberia, which resulted in discoveries about glaciation, the deserts of Eastern Asia, and mountain structure. He read Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's, 1809–1865, writings, which led him to resign his commission in protest of an execution of Polish prisoners, who had attempted to escape. After exploring the eskers of Finland, he was offered the position of Secretary of the Russian Geological Society in 1872. But instead went to Switzerland to meet exiled radicals. Kropotkin decided he was an anarchist after moving interactions with Bakunin's followers among the watchmakers of Jura. The watchmakers were conscientious craftsmen who were not part of the wider industrial revolution, and their cooperation in a close-knit community inspired Kropotkin. When he returned to Russia, he joined the underground, and in 1874 was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress. He escaped to Europe, where he founded the journal Le Revolt in 1879 and participated in the London International Anarchist Congress in 1881. In Lyons, France, in 1882, he was sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment for being a member of the International Workingmen's Association, but public outcry led to an early release. After that, he went to England and remained there, returning to Russia after the Russian Revolution of 1917. When Kropotkin lived in England, he worked mainly as a scholar. Leading scientific journals and publishers printed his work. His most important publications were Memoirs of a Revolutionist, 1899, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, 1902, and Modern Science and Anarchism, 1912. His last work, Ethics, was published in 1924 after he died in Russia. Kropotkin's final years were disappointing to him because the aftermath of the Russian Revolution defied his anarchist ideals. He denounced the Bolshevik reign of terror after the October Revolution.
Who was Edmund Husserl?
Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938. Is recognized as the founder of phenomenology as a systematic method of philosophy. He also created an important and new perspective on logic and mathematics, which distinguished them from empirically discovered psychological rules of thought. Husserl's major works are Logical Investigations, 1900, The Idea of Phenomenology, 1907, and Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Investigation, 1913.
What were some noteworthy advances in medicine during the scientific revolution?
During the scientific revolution, William Harvey, 1579–1657, correctly described and demonstrated the closed circulatory system of blood. Robert Burton, 1577–1640, described, and lived out, the nature of psychological depression. With Harvey's achievement, the inside of the human body could be understood as an orderly mechanical, hydraulic system. With Burton's achievement came the recognition of mental illness as a secular, pedestrian process. Both achievements were practical and gratifying rewards for scientific investigators, as well as their public.
What did the religious and humanist existentialists contribute?
The religious existentialists reconciled Sartrean ideas of freedom with the Judaic-Christian tradition. The humanist existentialists brought the more abstract aspects of existentialism into literature or developed them in different directions philosophically.
Does Gorgia's conclusion that whatever is real cannot be thought make sense?
No, there is a gap in his reasoning. Just because thinking about a thing is no guarantee that the thing exists, does not mean that none of our thoughts are thoughts about what exists.
Who was William Hamilton?
William Hamilton, 1788–1856, was a professor at Scotland's University of Edinburgh. He is famous for his philosophy of the conditioned in Scottish common sense philosophy. He agreed with Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, that we cannot know things in themselves. but also with Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, about naturalism. Reid's idea that we know things in the world directly and Kant's idea that we do not know things in themselves are contradictory. Hamilton believed that they could be mysteriously combined through intuition. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, in an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, 1865. Vigorously attacked Hamilton's notion that scientific principles are intuitively valid, rather than valid on account of their ability to provide causal explanations, as Mill thought.
Who were the encyclopedists?
They were scholars who attempted to systematically present all of human knowledge at their time. Chief among them were Boethius, 480 c. 525, of Italy, whose work went far beyond the alphabetized speculations of the other two who best represented this period, St. Isidore of Seville, 560 to 636, and the Venerable Bede of Britain, 674 to 735. Both Isidore and the Bede were clerics who devoted their lives to ecclesiastical service. Isidore compiled Etymologia, or Origins, which was a systematic presentation of all available learning during his time and endured as a textbook in church schools for hundreds of years. The Venerable Bede was best known for his histories, particularly that of Britain. The next real philosophical luminary was Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 815 to 877.
Why was Averroes considered important by other philosophers?
Averroes, known as Ibn Rushd in the Islamic world, c. 1126 c. 1198, was born in Córdoba, Spain. He brought the tradition of comparative philosophy begun by Avicenna and rendered problematic by Al-Ghazali to a new level of intellectual sophistication. His main project was to settle the debate among his contemporaries about whether Aristotle's philosophy was compatible with Islam. As Avicenna had claimed, or opposed to it as Al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, had objected.
How did Alan Sokal attack postmodernism?
New York University physicist Alan Sokal wrote a spoof of postmodern scholarship titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which was published by the postmodern journal Social Texts in its 1996 Spring/Summer Science Wars issue. When his article came out, Sokal simultaneously confessed his hoax in the academic gossip journal Lingua Franca. He referred to his Social Text article as a pastiche of left-wing Kant, fawning references, grandiose quotations, and outright nonsense, which was structured around the silliest quotations. I could find about mathematics and physics that recent postmodernist academics had written.
Did Socrates really exist?
Socrates of Athens, 460 to 399 B. CE, was both a real historical person and the main character in Plato's dialogues. In both modes, he perfected the methods of the sophists in rhetoric, argument, and dialogue. But as a character in Plato's later dialogues he appears mainly as a mouthpiece for Plato's abstract philosophy. While there is some controversy about how much concerning Socrates, the philosopher, was invented by Plato, there is stable agreement about certain facts of his life. All agree that Socrates lived the principles he taught. The most famous being, the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates' father, Sophroniscus, was a stonecutter from Alopic, and his mother, Phainaret, was a midwife. Socrates himself was fond of referring to his philosophical manner of discourse as a form of midwifery. In Plato's Meno, he uses this role to extract mathematical truths from a slave boy as proof of the presence of innate ideas in the soul, which are first acquired in a divine realm before birth. Sophroniscus was friends with Athenian general and statesman Aristides the Just, 530 to 468 BCE, which helped Socrates become connected throughout his life with the leadership class of Athens. He served ably and courageously as a hoplite, infantryman, in the Peloponnesian War. 431 to 404 BCE. When he became absorbed in philosophical activities, however, he became poor. Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, was depicted as a shrew in later writings about him, but he cared for his young sons and asked his friends to provide for their Socratic education after his death. Socrates was condemned to death for not believing in the gods the state believes in, and introducing different new divine powers, and also for corrupting the young. According to the indictments related in Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, he died peacefully by his own hand, drinking a cup of hemlock in preference to the escape arranged by his friends, which would have resulted in a life of exile. He refused exile because it was dishonorable and because he had voluntarily lived in Athens and accepted its laws throughout his life. To desert his city so as to avoid death would be disloyal in his mind. Socrates said he did not fear death, because he knew nothing about it. If there were no afterlife, dying would be like falling asleep. And if there were an afterlife it would enable a higher stage of discourse, it would be heaven. Another interpretation is that Socrates did not have much to lose by dying, he was already an old man.
Was Immanuel Kant only interested in the foundations for knowledge of the physical world?
No. In addition to what Kant held to be man's universal awe for the starry heavens above, He addressed the moral law within as a subject of practical reason. He also had lasting things to say about the self and belief in God.
Who was Paracelsus?
Paracelsus was the pseudonym of Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombast, a.k.a. Bombastus, von Hohenheim, 1493–1541. His father was a medical doctor in Switzerland. Paracelsus traveled continuously after age 15 and studied medicine in Germany and Austria. He then traveled in Europe, combining surgery with his medical practice. Surgery was then considered a craft lower in status than medicine. So this was a significant risk for any physician. In 1516 Paracelsus became a medical lecturer at the University of Basel. After he cured the famous printer Frobenius. His teachings against Avicenna, 980-1037, and Galen, c. 129 c. 216 CE, were controversial. And he was forced to resume his life of travel in 1528. Paracelsus introduced several lasting medical innovations: chemical urinalysis, a biochemical theory of digestion; wound antisepsis, the use of laudanum for pain, and the use of mercury for syphilis. His books were mainly about human nature and the place of man in the cosmos. But he also wrote important treatises on syphilis.
What was the Quine-Putnam theory of mathematics?
Called by professional philosophers the indispensability argument for mathematical realism. It basically asserted the existence of mathematical entities. W. V. Quine, 1908–2000, and Hilary Putnam, 1926, argued that we have to commit to the existence of, or have ontological commitments to, things that are indispensable for the best science. Mathematical entities qualify as indispensable. Therefore, we must commit to their existence.
Who were the Philosophes?
The term philosophy can and has been applied to virtually all intellectuals who advocated change in the world order during the decades leading up to the American and French revolutions. In that sense, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and Benjamin Franklin were all philosophes. However, to tell a manageable history of philosophy, it is useful to narrow the term down to the French encyclopedists and Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, Gotthold Lessing, and Cesare Beccaria.
Who was Tenskwatawa?
The prophet, Tenskwatawa, also known as Tenskatawa, or by his original name. Lalathika, 1775 to 1834, was the brother of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa was a powerful orator who preached a return to Native American traditions as a form of resistance against destruction and oppression suffered. In a speech to Governor William Henry Harrison in 1810, he expressed what was later to become a broadly American form of self-creation. Combined with biting wit, it is true I am a Shawnee. My forefathers were warriors. Their son is a warrior. From them I take only my existence, from my tribe I take nothing. I am the maker of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make of my own fortune, and oh, that I could make that of my red people, and of my country. As great as the conceptions of my mind, when I think of the spirit that rules the universe. I would not then come to Governor Harrison to ask him to tear the treaty and to obliterate the landmark. But I would say to him, Sir, you have liberty to return to your own country.
How do the Chichlans account for perceptions of meaning?
Meaning is fixed by networks of association. Ultimately, meaning will be replaced by connectionist networks with activation along preferred vectors. Sameness of meaning is no more than a sameness of patterns. In the library of the future, there will be plugs for directly activating relevant brain states and patterns. Bypassing the need to transmit meanings via language as we now know it.
Is philosophy only found in the West?
No. As individual intellectual tendencies and cultural traditions. Philosophy has been present in all human societies since the beginning of recorded history and probably farther back than that. In the United States and Europe, philosophy, as an intellectual profession practiced by academics, developed as an official part of the higher education curriculum during the 20th century. But many societies, particularly those that are still peopled by the original or indigenous inhabitants of a place, have maintained their philosophies through oral traditions. Oral traditions in African philosophy and Native American philosophy often deal with questions about time, space, origins, and ethics. There are also well-developed textual traditions, going back at least as far as Socrates. In Indian philosophy, Japanese philosophy, and Chinese philosophy, collectively called Asian philosophy or Eastern philosophy. These systems of thought are increasingly part of standard philosophy curricula in the United States, as are comparative philosophy, African American philosophy, and Latin American philosophy.
What is the difference between critical theory and structuralism?
There is no clear distinction of practice that practitioners of both schools of thought would accept. Many structuralists denied being structuralists, and some critical theorists were unaware of the term critical theory. But from the standpoint of a reader, it may help to keep in mind that both structuralism and critical theory provide analyses of society that need not be accepted by the members of society being analyzed. The term critical theory is associated with the Frankfurt School, which developed the 20th century version of scholarly Marxism. The term structuralism refers to a study of mental structures in society. Critical theory seeks to provide analyses that further progressive and egalitarian social goal. Structuralism also uses critical theory. Although the members and followers of the Frankfurt School were not narrowly political, their Marxist legacy tended to point them in certain political directions. While structuralists might have shared certain goals with Marxian critical theorists, their subjects were other social institutions besides government. They also took up Freudian psychology and were instrumental in laying the foundations for a new focus on language and symbols as an important philosophical subject. In some quarters, given the successors or intellectual heirs of structuralism, language and the symbolic order became the only intellectual subject. That is, the structuralists paved the way for intellectual postmodernism, which is also known as post-structuralism.
Is there or has there been an African philosophy?
There is a millennially long tradition of oral African philosophy, as well as many active 20th century African philosophers. Once this thought is presented in established Western philosophical terms, however, it does not so much support Afrocentrism as a perspective of racial uplift as it evinces a philosophy by asking questions about its own philosophical enterprise. That is, a great deal of contemporary African philosophy is itself concerned with the question of whether it is philosophy and what that means in an African, although not Afrocentrist, context. The context is not Afrocentrist because Africans who remained in Africa and were not brought to Europe or the Americas had no need for the distinctive uplift of Afrocentrism. Instead, the focus on Africa from an African perspective turns on the question of what the multiplicity of countries and cultures in Africa, each with distinct languages and traditions, have in common so that they can view themselves as African. They share a colonized past and poverty in the present world. They have been designated by biological race, though this is an illusion. Contemporary philosophical sources for African philosophy include Kwame Anthony Appiah. In My Father's House, Africa in the Philosophy of Culture, 1992, Kwame Gyke, Tradition and Modernity. 1997, Emmanuelise, editor, Post-Colonial African Philosophy, 1970, Paulin J. Hauntanji, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality, 1983, John Biddy, African Religions and Philosophy. 1970, Albert Moseley, editor, African Philosophy, Selected Readings, 1995, h. Adira Orica, editor, Sage Philosophy, 1990, Tsneserekwaberhan, editor. African Philosophy, The Essential Readings, 1991, Kwasi Wiredu, editor, A Companion to African Philosophy. 2004, and Richard Wright, editor, African Philosophy, An Introduction, 1984.
What is applied ethics?
Applied ethics is the study of existing ethical principles in practical fields of human endeavor, such as medicine, engineering, business, law, and environmentalism. Applied ethics also extends to new moral rules for new situations, such as the rights of airline passengers and disaster victims, moral issues involved in human cloning, and consumer protection. In this sense, applied ethics is practical ethics. It is a study of ethics of practice. In addition, applied ethics can be more critical as it applies theoretical moral systems and moral theories to practices and fields outside of philosophy. Existing rules and behavior in a given field may be theoretically justified or criticized by philosophical ethicists. In some cases, new moral directions may emerge. Environmental ethics is a good example of the theoretical dimension of applied ethics.
How did Hull House fulfill pragmatist ideals of knowledge?
Adams saw Hull House as an epistemological, theory of knowledge, project, as much as a charitable program. She wrote, "The ideal and developed settlement would attempt to test the value of human knowledge by action and realization, quite as the complete and ideal university would concern itself with the discovery of knowledge in all branches."
What is Thomas Kuhn's paradigm theory?
Although Kuhn himself noted that he used the word paradigm in at least 23 different ways in the first edition of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. The core meaning is that a paradigm defines and prescribes how research is conducted in a science. And it also presents a picture of the world as studied by that science. During normal science, all practitioners are expected to work within the reigning paradigm of their field and extend accepted theories to new circumstances. There is widespread agreement on one coherent worldview in a mature science. In immature sciences, competing schools of thought have followers who defend the paradigm of the viewpoint they subscribe to. Paradigms are not absolutely true for all time and can be literally overthrown by the adoption of new paradigms.
Who was David Hume?
David Hume, 1711 to 1776, was the first philosopher in the Western tradition to construct a system of thought that had no intellectual reliance on God. His atheism was not merely a matter of personal belief, but was based on an application of skepticism to claims that the existence of God could be known by reason. Hume extended that skepticism to the nature of knowledge about the world, as well, and showed how limited our knowledge of both cause and effect, and the future, really is. He was the first, thoroughly modern, naturalistic philosopher.
What are some of the major philosophical arguments made in Meditations?
Descartes believed it was necessary to take the entire edifice of knowledge down to its foundations to remove existing error. His method was not to doubt everything for the sake of skepticism itself, but to doubt everything that could be doubted, so that one would be left only with what was certain. He began with the usual arguments about the errors of the senses. For instance, the observation that far-away objects look smaller than they are. He then questioned whether he could be sure that there was a world outside of his mind and noted that the insanity of that line of questioning was not unusual if one takes into account the fact that every night, during sleep, there are bizarre distortions in dreams. This raises the question of what exactly is the difference between being awake and being asleep. Descartes notes that there is nothing in the quality of either experience that guarantees which state one is in. Descartes' project of doubt next addresses mathematical and logical thinking. Descartes said that our confidence in these processes depends on our confidence that there is a benevolent God who guarantees that what seems self-evident to us really is true, and who guarantees the accuracy of the memory of those past thought processes that are necessary to proceed to a conclusion in a chain of reasoning. So now Descartes has raised doubt to the level of doubting the existence of a good and powerful God, which he himself regards as a very disturbing and distressing predicament. So now Descartes has raised doubt to the level of doubting the existence of a good and powerful God, which he himself regards as a very disturbing and distressing predicament.
Teresa, and what were her main ideas?
St. Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, entered the Carmelite order when she was 22. And there she sought guidance in how to pray until she was 47. In 1560 she became part of the reform movement among the Spanish Carmelites. Her main works were the Vita, Life, which was her spiritual autobiography, and Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. Her main project was to help readers surrender to the Divine Trinity. Teresa held that mysticism developed in stages. In her life, she says that the soul is like a garden. First, weeds need to be removed and then water must be carried from a well. The senses must be subdued to minimize distraction during this initial labor of prayer and meditation. The prayer of quiet in the second stage is like irrigation with the help of a water wheel. And in the third stage a condition of contemplation is achieved, which is analogous to having a running brook through one's garden. By this time, the senses no longer function normally and the soul wants to withdraw from the world and unite with God. In the fourth stage, this union is achieved. In the interior castle. Teresa uses the analogy of a castle with many rooms to describe a life of contemplation. After 6 early stages, the soul comes into the direct presence of God. In what way was St.
How did Charles Hartshorne's system of the universe work?
All human sensations, according to Hartshorne, are feelings, and nature itself is the totality of all interactions of sentient, creative beings, which exist for all time in God's memory. The entire universe is literally God's body. The most important values which can be sensed and are immortal as events of sensation concern beauty. Beauty can be theoretically understood as a mean between order and disorder and / or simplicity and complexity.
What was Otto Neurath's main philosophical contribution?
First, Neurath thought that the only connection between language and reality was metaphorical, and he believed that, at best, language and world coincide only because reality is all previously verified sentences. This required a coherence theory of truth for each individual sentence. A sentence is true if it coheres with already verified sentences. Only the entire language system can be verified. Neurath famously wrote, "We are like sailors who on the open sea must reconstruct their ship but are never able to start afresh from the bottom. Where a beam is taken away, a new one must at once be put there. And for this the rest of the ship is used as support." In this way, by using the old beams and driftwood, the ship can be shaped entirely anew. But only by gradual reconstruction. Second, Neurath did not think that phenomenalism could provide a valid foundation for scientific language because sense data are subjective. His alternative was to propose that mathematical physics be used for objective descriptions, a doctrine known as physicalism. Furthermore, language itself could be described in the language of mathematical physics because it is material, constituted by sounds and graphic symbols.
Who are some Dark Ages philosophers who came after St. Augustine?
After St. Augustine's death in 430, the so-called Dark Ages, roughly 420 to 1000 CE. Ensued. In 420 the Visigoths living inside of Rome sacked the city. In monasteries in Italy, Spain, and Britain, the encyclopedists emerged.
What did Friedrich Nietzsche mean by the birth of tragedy?
Nietzsche was influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860. Who thought that the real world underlying everyday reality was composed of will, best perceived by us in music. According to Nietzsche, tragedy as an art form was an invention of the ancient Greeks, before Socrates. In order to cope with the chaotic and sorrowful nature of their lives, and indeed of life itself. The tragic play was a rational and beautiful dramatic structure, created by Apollo, the god of reason, which allowed the audience to participate in the underlying, frenzied reality of disorder. This underlying disorder and merging of everything into an anguished but expressive, drunken whole was what Nietzsche called the Dionysian element in Greek life. Thus, the Apollonian element of reason allowed the Dionysian element of disorder to emerge in the dramatic form of the tragedy. For the vicarious participation of the audience, who was represented by the chorus in the tragic play. In The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, which was his doctoral dissertation, Nietzsche quoted the great tragic playwright, Sophocles. There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When Silenus at last fell into his hands, the king asked what was the best and most desirable of all things for man. Fixed and immovable, the demigod said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words, "O, wretched ephemeral race, children of chance and misery! Why do you compel me to tell you what it would be most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is utterly beyond your reach, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is to die soon.